This is House Planning Help, episode 136. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Alongside this, I'm attempting to tackle my own project. I wanted to build an energy-efficient home before I turn 40, which is coming up next month now. What? Today, though, a different session. It's going to be 6 observations from 6 passive house projects. Let me explain where we're going with this one today. It's because over the last few weeks, I've been doing various filming for the UK Passive House Awards. And in fact, we've had a few podcasts as well. It would have been nice to have done podcasts on all of them. Sometimes there just wasn't time. However, not only have I seen these projects, but I've been working quite closely doing the editing for them as well. So I know them quite well, and also some of the stories, and plus the fact that I've been making 2-minute videos for the UK Passive House Awards, and that means there's a lot of stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor. So that's what I thought today. Okay, this is a slightly personal look at these projects and just things that I've taken from them, but we'll be using some audio clips along the way. So we're going to start with Goldcar Passive House, one of the shortlisted projects. And this we covered in episode 134. My takeaway here was that really they've done a great job at the Green Building Store of making sure their team has taken Passive House as a matter of course. And I think that that's a really interesting thing. So what I've got first of all is a clip of 2 of the guys on the building team. This is Jude Wilson, who speaks first. He's the foreman, and then Andy Nuttall. And they're explaining how better building practices have got under their skin.
As we've been doing these 2 big projects, it is evolving and becoming more natural, and the processes that we're doing, we've learned them and we know how to do them now, so it's natural and it's second nature just to get on and do it. So we just need everyone else to be doing the same things as we're doing.
And it's just making sure everything's airtight. You do stuff without realising now, taping over screw heads and making sure there's no air leakages anywhere. To us, it's simple, really.
Yeah, Bill set it up, we've done it, we've had his hand held on other projects, and now we're free to do it and implement it ourselves without him having to watch over us. We know what we're doing, we know the standard required, and we just managed to do it, so we just keep going.
And luckily we've got the tapes, we've got the NVHRs, the decent windows and doors from our company, so we can get it all in-house, and we do everything ourselves, so there's no crossover of other people coming in and drilling big holes in, and we keep an eye on everything. That's what you need if you're going to build passive houses.
Andy Nuttall and also Jude Wilson in our clip just then. And if you want more on that story and you haven't listened to the episode that we did on Goldcar Passive House, then head back a couple to episode 134 with Angie and Paul. Really interesting. Paul also featuring in the building team, which I thought was fascinating. It worked really well. That was the other thing. Apparently he had to be accepted into the building team. Let's move on to the next one. We're doing this actually in an order of how I saw the projects. So the next one was Lime Tree Passive House. And this is a project that Parsons and Whitley put together. Again, we've covered this in a podcast. And what I love about this, well, that's not my key takeaway, is that it's constraint driven. And I think that over the course of the year, this is something that I've really come to understand. We also did a podcast with Andrew Mitchler a little while back where he talked about constraints. And I think I'm understanding it more and more that actually constraints are quite exciting and they can really lead a project and test an architect and come away with some good, clever ways of solving the problem. So the problem here was that they had a tree that took up virtually half of the plot because of all the roots underneath. And it was just really, really tricky. So what do? Well, you arc around the tree and you also get some of those spaces looking out onto this garden. And what's incredible being inside this building is that you don't really get a sense of anyone else around you, whereas you're actually in quite a built-up part of town. So I thought that was so clever, and when you finally see the video for this, you'll appreciate that as well. Some of the aerial shots really show it. My takeaway, though, I've decided is going to be that I've always had this concern that if you're hiring someone to build your passive house, you're really taking a risk if they've never done it before. However, Chris Parsons, a man who's done it many times before as the architect, has this advice.
Choosing contractors to deliver passive house is still difficult because there are very few that have got the experience, but my mantra is always, have they got the attitude? Are they really interested in delivering the performance and understanding that that's delivered simply through close attention to detail and quality? So no, I don't think experience is the necessary factor, it's the right cultural approach.
Oh, he's a wise man, that Chris Parsons, isn't he? And I think that this is quite an interesting point. So we're going to move straight into a clip from the contractor. On this project, it was Grocott and Murphy, and we've got Daniel Grocott just explaining how they prepared themselves for this particular project.
As it was our first passive house, we thought it was important we got to know as much about the passive house process as we could. So we therefore organised the passive house training for the two directors of the company. 5-day training course where we learnt a little bit of theory behind the passive house process, as well as implementing some technical things on site, such as methods to get the air tightness, a little bit of info about mechanical ventilation. We found this very, very useful and interesting, so we therefore organised for the trainers to come to our premises back in Norfolk, where they trained a dozen of our guys for 2 days, to give them a bit of insight into why we build in the passive house way.
That's Daniel Grocott. And Daniel told me another story that I'm going to relay to you now about his team having gone through all of this, the steep learning curve, found it really interesting, really proud of what they've achieved. At the end saying, so why don't we do every building like this? And Daniel was going, I'm not sure how I should answer that one. Hopefully we're moving in this direction though. Talking about my direction, next I go north out of England into Scotland and close to Inverness. This is the edge of the Scottish Highlands. It gets really beautiful around here, and John and Jeanette, who are the clients on this project, I know, they just wanted to retire to somewhere like this that they could just look out their window and see a beautiful mountain range or go hiking up there. So they're in exactly the right place. This piece of land was formerly used for crofting, so it'd been decommissioned, and now they wanted a traditional steading, something perhaps with a contemporary update to it, and that's exactly what they've got with Tyner Croft. It's white render, it's slate, it's beautiful lines the whole way inside and out, and a lot of the views as well. That's one of the clever things with this. They've got some floor-to-ceiling glass, and I remember Jeanette saying to me a couple of times, it's great that we've managed to design what we wanted rather than thinking, oh, it's going to get cold up here, let's design lots of small rooms. Their only heating source is a stove as well for this whole building, yet obviously they've got access to wood and logs, so it makes sense for them. I'm particularly interested in the form of the building. This is Ross Barrett from HLM Architects.
Some of the other challenges we gave ourselves really was in terms of the form of the house itself. Whilst we tried to keep that as compact as we possibly could, the L shape that we went for, that does respond to site and respond to morning light, for example, the bedrooms face east, the main living spaces face south. But that gave us a challenge in terms of passive house itself, because it meant that it wasn't as simple and compact as a form as it maybe could be. Some of the other challenges we gave ourselves were trying to create some double height spaces out of the architecture. So the main rooms, such as the living room, we were very keen to make sure that was a double height space. That gave us challenges in terms of moving air around the house. Likewise with the bedroom, we went for a double height space, and the central space in the house as well. It's a really lovely space though, it brings in lots of daylight and it really makes the architecture.
Again, it's interesting that the building really following the architectural form and flair and what they wanted to do, yet still a passive house. We see that time and time again, whereas probably a few years ago, we wouldn't at all. It would just be, can we make it to passive house standard? After this point, I went to East London and saw a project that Bernard Tolkins had not only been the architect for, but he was the client, and this was beside his house. It was an extra piece of land that had been included when he bought his house, say, around about 10 years ago, and he'd always had an eye on it, thinking one day the time will be right to develop that, and it actually slots onto the neighbouring street. So a perfect opportunity. You could go crazy and just build over the entire piece of land. He's been very modest in this. Also, I love the way how on this one, although it's a fairly small house, it's got some big spaces, some flexible spaces as well, and I think it works really nicely. There are plenty of challenges on this project. For example, not really a south-facing facade, so they had to rely a lot on west-facing glazing, which of course introduces difficulties, and they have to be resolved by increasing insulation and just making sure you shade it really, really carefully. This was also not for profit for him, so it's not as if he's then going to sell it off. It's really for family use, and I think for a large portion of the year, part of the family will come up and stay in this property. So really like this. It's zinc clad. It certainly, I think, fits in very well into the Victorian setting of the majority of buildings round there. One thing that I thought was particularly interesting on this project was his decision, because if you imagine an architect, you're constantly doing other people's projects. This is his own. And so when you have these lovely, it's cross-laminated timber that was used to build the house, well, why cover it up?
When you realize that by reducing the elements you use, and not having to choose finishes, you avoid a whole set of traps. I thought, why, if I'm building a building for myself, would I start lining up a timber construction with plasterboard and worry about shadow gaps or skirting boards or recessed lighting? No, I just decided that timber was going to be nice enough as a finish, and there was no client in my house, so the decision was mine. Are you happy to see that? Yes.
Perhaps the trick here that Bernard really got right is also totally embracing it with the whole building. And I think it's actually quite subtle in the end. You may not notice it as much as you think you might, exposing the bones of the building. In another clip, I remember him explaining how his kids totally understand the layer on layer approach of the building, because it's a bit like an onion. You peel back those layers and you can just understand the construction. So definitely one to check out the video and to see some photos from that East London project. Next, I went west to the Chiswick Eco Lodge. This one, wow, my goodness, it was a 7-year project. And I think for me, it just underlined, sometimes as a self-builder and even as an architect, you've got to have determination. It was just one thing after another. I suppose it started with what was a fairly small site. So they needed to develop a large portion of that. It was a garage infill. And some of the issues they had, for example, there was a tree right in front of the access route to that plot. So they have to work their way around that and the root structure as well. Then, as I mentioned, they're trying to get into the ground to make the most of this. So I think 60% of the building was under the ground. That means digging it all out, and the foundations, I think they had some trouble there and then needed to use concrete. So they decided to adapt the design and almost turn it into a feature, which I really liked. And they have this central staircase, which I'm not sure what the technique is. It's certainly worth looking at some pictures of this because it's come out so well, and it just gives the building some identity. It's a building that's just beautifully finished, slightly contemporary. And the one thing I haven't mentioned so far is actually what the client, Oliver, is going to tell us about.
Well, planning was a very big problem. It took 4 separate applications. We got there in the end. I have to say that the planning officers always approved the build, so they're on board. But the local councillors, when it went to committee, ensured that it failed on every occasion until the head of planning came to the site on the 4th occasion and spent a long time here with my neighbours and with me, and they had a long look at it and realised that really this site could be improved and would benefit from having Ealing's first certified passive house, and that's what they've got.
They have certainly done well. And before I even knew about the whole planning saga story, I bumped into one of the neighbours and was saying to them, I'm really impressed with this building. I think it looks great. I love the way that, although it's contemporary, it somehow just slots into that street scene beautifully. And then they've got this planting all around the building that again just helps to blend those boundaries. And the neighbour, admittedly, might not have been one of the ones protesting, but was just saying, yeah, I totally agree, I think it's a great project. So it goes to show that people at the time of construction can be opposed to this development. I can understand it from both sides, and I know that Oliver really felt it those days when the lorries come in, or a piece of machinery or something that needs to block the road for a while. It's not too pleasant, isn't it? Not only for yourself, but for everyone else around there. So this was about endurance. It was about believing in that finished house, something that would improve the area. And I just think so impressive what they've been finished with. So that was the Chiswick project. Then I moved further west out to the old water tower. You know a bit about this if you heard the last podcast, episode 135, with Tom Grieford, the architect. And he had this piece of land that he spotted at auction, just saw an opportunity, went for it, got the land, and this hideous, ugly water tower was taken down. And he put on what was effectively looked like a contemporary agricultural building from across the fields. It just blends beautifully into the landscape. And the clip that we're going to hear here is with Mike Jacob, who was the project manager. We've actually spoken to him way back in the archive in episode 27. Clearly, he's done a number of low energy projects, and this was one tip that stood out when I chatted to him.
I think that we were in safe hands with the timber frame specialist. So one of the lessons that we've learned from the past is to try and go for easy wins. And there are companies out there now who will take control of delivering a guaranteed thermally bridge-free, airtight, super insulated box. And they can do that very quickly. So on the basis that we were working alongside MBC, who delivered a slab and a frame, a lot of the pain was taken away.
Interesting lessons on simplifying the process that he's built up over time there. This building also, again, it was another project that demonstrated to me that it's not always about south-facing glazing. In this case, it was just the way the plot was, that you looked out onto these fantastic fields. Really, you could see for miles and miles. So that had to be, or that's where architecturally you would like the views to be. So there was a lot of glazing on the west-facing elevation. And I just think overall, really nice contemporary feel, this barn-type aesthetic, beautiful spaces. I would love to go back there when there's a family in and just get a feel for it, because of course as a development at the moment it's quite clinical, but I think it's very, very quickly going to turn into a beautiful home for a family. So those were the projects that I checked out for this year's UK Passive House Awards 2016. Such a lot of fun. So pleased the emphasis was on self-build for personal reasons, because I enjoy going to see all of the buildings. And if you want more details, in the show notes, we'll obviously link you up with the Passive House Trust website, where you can go and get the full details. What's always great when they talk about a project on their website, they completely break it down into this is what build system they use, these are the people that they had on there. So if you're ever interested and think, oh, who did that? I like the look of this, or I like the feel of this, I'd like to go and get more details. So the Passive House Trust website will also embed all of the videos that I made into today's show notes, because this podcast launches around the time of the awards, so we'll get that in straight away. And yeah, another year of the UK Passive House Awards. I guess the next thing, what's it, the conference and then the Passive House Open Days. We're speeding on another year, aren't we? So we're just about there for today. I hope you've enjoyed that. Just a quick reflection on some of the projects that I've seen that hopefully you get a chance to hear about as well. And maybe even some of the ones that we missed. I said at the time that I'd love to have interviewed everyone. On occasions, it just wasn't time. So it's possible in the future I will get that chance to chat to them then. Let's finish up with a hub update, and we've got a module on roofing, which goes from the basics of why do we need roofs? Oh, actually, we don't want to get wet. We don't want our building to get wet as well. And then goes into more depth and covering how it's done in Passive House and warm and cold roofs and why you go for one over the other. Also, we had the latest video from Long Barrow. This time we see the roof go on, so we're progressing nicely, and we have a walk around those internal spaces, because of course when you've got 4 sides of the building plus a roof, it starts to feel quite different. So Alex explains what the next stages are. And then we've got our Facebook group, our private community where we go to. We're also this month looking forward to our first progress call, so I'll report back on how that goes. If you'd like to become a member, it costs only £99 for the whole year. That's still exceptional value. There's a lot that we're trying to cram into membership, and we always have plans for more things that we can add just to give you better service. It's a lock-in price too. You can get all the details, in fact, by going to houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it. Once again, thank you so much for being there. Next time round, we've got an interesting one. We'll be chatting to Philip Singleton, who is part of the Gravenhill team. He's the managing director of the whole project. So it's going to be a really interesting one, hearing the story, where we're up to so far, what it means, some of the challenges, some of the things that we're going to learn. And I think you're going to enjoy that chat. So be there next time. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.